by the Commerce Committee. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Call on Members' Order of the Day number 3.
Dairy Industry Restructuring Amendment Bill number 2, first reading.
Speaker.
Call the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Dairy Industry Restructuring Amendment Bill number 2 be now read a first time. Mr Speaker, I nominate the Primary Production Committee to consider the bill. The purpose of this bill is to place a legislative limit on the proportion of Fonterra cooperative shares that can be sold by farmers into the new co-op unit fund. The bill provides that Fonterra must ensure that the new co-op fund does not constitute more than 20% of the total number of cooperative shares. If the 20% limit is reached, Fonterra must cease the sale of shares into the new co-op fund and take action to reduce the proportion of shares in the new co-op fund to below 20% limit within 90 days. Mr Speaker, the current Dairy Industry Restructuring Act places no legislated limit on the proportion of Fonterra cooperative shares that can be sold by farmers into this fund, Mr Speaker, and I am proposing that a legislated limit is needed for this company. Mr Speaker, Fonterra is our single largest company. It is a cooperative. It controls about 40% of the global trade in dairy products throughout the world, Mr Speaker. It is a cooperative, as I said, and owned by New Zealand dairy farmers. There are very few companies of any size that are owned by New Zealanders, Mr Speaker, in this country. The dairy industry has been built through the wisdom of the Labour Party from 1930s through the 50s, through the 80s, well, where the Labour Party brought in place, firstly, price guarantee for dairy farmers. Secondly, it merged the dairy board, it created the dairy board, Mr Speaker, and then we in 2000, we created Fonterra in legislation, Mr Speaker. The successful dairy industry is being guided by legislation, wise legislation, endorsed by parties across this House, Mr Speaker. What we had last year was a new capital restructure of Fonterra, Mr Speaker. It was called Trading Among Foreigners. No, Trading Among Farmers, Mr Speaker. The dairy industry arguably is one of the most, as I say, not only successful but attractive industries for investors. Going back into the 1990s, the New Zealand Dairy Group, Mr Speaker, the single largest cooperative processing company, was focused on a corporate strategy for the dairy board. That was rejected by most participants in the dairy industry, but in the formation of Fonterra, Mr Speaker, I suggest that some of that corporate strategy continued on with the new management and governance of the company. There has been for many years a determination by some. Sir Henry van der Heyden has been on the record as saying that he wanted to restructure the capital of the cooperative Fonterra, and indeed, to recognise his success, he has done just so. The question is, what has that done for Fonterra? In a relatively short space of time, dairy farmers who are members of a cooperative that in its pure form have a nominal value share have moved from a fair value share of about $4.50 up to a listed unit price of $5.50, and now I think today is just short of the $8 per unit or $8 per share value. And many observers of the stock market might say, what a wonderful success. The problem for suppliers in a cooperative company who are obliged to buy one share, wet share, for every kilogram of milk solids that they produce, is that they have to front with a larger amount of capital to be active participating shareholders and owners of the company Fonterra. On top of that, we now have investors, about $500 million worth of investors, Mr Speaker, or be greater than that, who have the right to the dividend flow from the shares of Fonterra. They are not dairy farmers. and they have purchased the right through the purchase of units, Mr Speaker, a perfectly reasonable investment proposition allowed by the TAF legislation. What that has started to do is unravel the cooperative that we have been so proud of. And I'm sure Mr Ardern will get up and endorse some of the things I say. There are now dairy farmers who want to continue to be shareholding owners of Fonterra and grow their supply, but they can't afford to, Mr Speaker, because paying $8 for every additional kilogram of milk solids is not a smart investment decision for them. And I spoke today to a very astute farmer who has a number of farms, who has just signed a contract with Fonterra to supply them with just milk without any corresponding wet share purchase. Now that might seem a good deal too to someone, but to the dairy industry, Mr Speaker, and the success that it has been built of, this is the beginning of a new structure, and I say an unravelling of the dairy industry and its success. Because the incentives to increase production, which some say is a negative in terms of environmental impact, that incentive has now gone. That has now gone because it's not a sound economic proposition for many dairy farmers. The greatest beneficiaries of the TAF legislation have been foreign-owned companies and other dairy companies in this country, because the disincentive to supply additional milk to Fonterra has meant they have sought out opportunities with Open Country Cheese, a privately owned company, with Synlait, a Singaporean-owned company about to list, with Western Milk Products, a cooperative company, Mr Speaker. Tatua has its doors closed. But now on the horizon we have Yashili and Yili, two companies that dwarf Fonterra in terms of their total size, Chinese-owned companies that have come down and started to invest in this country. Now, some might say there's nothing wrong with that. And I'm certainly not opposed to Chinese investment in adding value to our economy. The problem is that their benefit may be off the back of Fonterra's new capital structure and a shrinking supply of milk to our #1 company and the biggest participant in the biggest industry in this country. The jury's out, Mr Speaker, on what that might mean over time. What Fonterra did in the lead-up was say many, many things to farmers to convince them that TAF was good for them, Mr Speaker. Many of those things were not true. They've said that if it doesn't work for farmers within 2 years, they will close down TAF. Mr Speaker, that won't occur. They've said that it wasn't about capital raising. They've said it will lock in ownership and control of Fonterra. Mr Speaker, those things are not true, because we're starting to see that unravel. What my bill does is put in legislation a limit to the total amount of Fonterra shares and units that can be traded on the open stock market. Because sure as night follows day, the chances are that those units trading on the stock market will fall into foreign hands and we'll lose the dividend streams. If the constitution of Fonterra was to be changed by over 75% of farmers, and that may occur because of internal pressure, then the size of that fund could be extended. Some will say the constitutional protection is enough. Mr Speaker, banks will tell farmers what to do when the payout drops. The farmers will be demanding access to the full value of their shares on an open trading market because they desperately need the money. That will be the pressure that ultimately unravels Fonterra. What I say through this bill is that before that happens, Fonterra should come back to Parliament, back to whatever government's in power, and ask for a change in legislation before it unravels before our eyes. The 20% limit on the unit fund size in legislation is the least that Parliament can do to protect our single largest company, one owned by New Zealand farmers, Mr Speaker, the most outstanding performer in the world of international dairy trade. Mr. Speaker, this is too valuable for us to lose. All I ask through this bill, and I hope the National Party will support it, is that they step in and put in a legislated limit, just as we put in place legislation to form the successful dairy industry across
Sorry
this country.
to interrupt the honourable member. The question is that the motion be agreed to. Shane Arden.
Mr. Speaker, it's a privilege to rise in this debate tonight.